You guys want more lights on? Oh, there we go. Oh, that's actually, is that better? Yeah, that's kind of better actually. Huh? Yeah. Okay. It's better on the screen. All right. So here we go. So today we're gonna deal with the other kind of chunk of the endocrine system. So we'll talk about those topics there: bone, calcium, which was also going to include phosphate and magnesium, the pancreas stuff. So that'll be insulin, glucagon, all of that. And then we'll look at both male and female reproductive systems. So again, lots of stuff here. And we'll have a presentation on osteoporosis, I think, right, Cassie? Yeah. Okay. All right. So this is just an image of the what are called the trabeculae inside of spongy bone and inside of our long bones. Inside of all of our bones, we have this trabeculae network of that kind of material. It looks like that. So okay, so let's talk about calcium first. Okay, so calcium, 99% of the calcium in the body is found inside a bone. Okay, so we've already talked about calcium quite a bit, right? We've talked about its role in cell signaling, right? Very, very important for cell signaling, very, very important for muscle contraction, including not just skeletal muscle contraction, but cardiac muscle contraction, smooth muscle contraction. So you don't have these ones right here on the right. Is that what you're raising your hand about, Celine? Yeah, you don't have this. I just added that right before class, but yeah, it's important to know. But mostly everything else is up to date. Is that what you're? Not that those three definitions I just put in there. I just was sparing myself and you from my writing for that last part, but yeah, write that down for sure. But yeah, everything else I updated, I uploaded like last Thursday. So that should be really the only big thing that's changed. But yeah, so lots of important roles for calcium, right? As well as nerve function, again, muscle contraction, and coagulation of the blood too. Since everybody's writing down those terms, I'll go ahead and talk about them. There's these three terms that are slightly easy to mix up and to not quite understand the difference between the three of them. So, and we'll be using those three terms. So the term absorption is just to bring something into the body. Okay, so typically we'll talk about absorption when we talk about the GI tract, right? And we'll talk about calcium absorption in the GI tract. So that's getting that calcium into the body from the GI tract. And remember, the GI tract, the urinary tract, reproductive tracts, all three of those are considered outside of the body still, right? Because they're open to the outside of the body. And so if something is in the GI tract and we bring it in, then we're bringing it into the body. We're absorbing it into the body, okay? The term reabsorption means that it was in the body and we put it into one of those three tracts, most likely the GI tract, GI tract, urinary tract, or reproductive tract, but then we brought it back for some reason. Okay, and that we're usually going to talk about reabsorption when we talk about the urinary system, right? The kidneys, in the kidneys, we're going to filter our blood, and then we create the stuff called filtrate, which eventually turns into urine, and it contains a bunch of stuff that we don't want to lose, right? Like glucose and other nutrients, as well as calcium and phosphate and all kinds of things. And so when we bring that stuff back, that's called reabsorption. Okay, but then this other one, resorption, sounds a lot like reabsorption, but it's not really the same thing. But we'll talk about that in terms of bone, which when we say bone resorption really just means we're actually decreasing our bone mass. Okay, so we're actually taking calcium out of bone. And that's really, that term resorption really just means loss of something, a fluid or a substance of the body. It doesn't mean we necessarily lose the calcium out of the body when we resorb bone, but we are losing bone in that case, right? And we can get it back by putting it back in the bone. But in that moment, we're taking calcium out of bone and adding it to the blood. So we're losing some bone there. So resorption of bone is something that we'll talk about too. Okay, so those three different terms are kind of important. I wanted to have them written down there. Okay, questions about those three things? Go ahead.
Is that the loss of fluid or substance like that into the body, or like how?
So yeah, it's not necessarily even that. It's just the idea that we're losing some bone. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that it leaves the body or it stays in the body. It's just that we don't have that bone anymore. Yeah, so good clarification. Yeah. Other questions on that? Okay, so the three primary hormones that help us control calcium. Number one, the most important, is called parathyroid hormone, abbreviated as PTH. Okay, its main job is to, or one of the main things it does, is it mobilizes calcium from the bone. So it causes bone resorption, okay, which then causes an increase in calcium in the blood. Okay, so if we're breaking down bone, we're pulling that calcium out of bone. And that's the way I just do the double plus sign, if you're wondering what that is next to calcium, because calcium is a +2. Okay. Yeah. So mobilize calcium from the bone, and then also increase phosphate. So PI for inorganic phosphate excretion. Okay, and that another term, excretion, that's mean getting rid of it and completely out of the body. Okay, so we're putting that into the urine most likely and getting rid of it. Okay, so that's our most important one. Our another very important one is this here. Okay, which there's multiple versions of these are vitamin D derived hormones. Okay, and the most important one is called calcitrol. Okay, and we'll talk about that one in a sec. Yes, there'll be more on it, but these are vitamin D steroid hormones. Okay, and kind of one of their primary roles is to increase calcium absorption from the GI tract. Okay, and then we also have calcitonin. And calcitonin, which gland was that released from? We talked about it a little bit last time. Thyroid, yeah. So it's our other kind of hormone that comes from the thyroid gland. Its job is kind of the opposite of parathyroid. Okay, so it's going to inhibit bone resorption. Okay, but it has a very minor role in calcium levels in the blood. When there's no calcitonin available, it doesn't really matter. The calcium levels are still maintained fine, and so it doesn't have a major role under normal conditions. So if it's inhibiting, if parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium, then calcitonin would do the opposite. It would decrease calcium in the blood. Okay, that's just a little overview. We'll talk about each of these hormones more in a sec. Okay, questions about any of that so far? All right, anybody need more time to write those things down? Okay. All right, so let's talk about absorption in the GI tract first, okay? And as well as the calcium pool in the body, okay? So when we look at an intestinal cell like this, okay, we have different types of channels that allow calcium to come in, okay? So most of them have this TRP kind of acronym to them, okay? And yeah, and so really when we bring calcium into cells, we're using some kind of calcium channel like that, okay? We'll see a different type in the kidneys, okay? That's the TRPV6, okay? One thing that's interesting, just kind of an interesting problem that cells that transport calcium have to think, or not have to think about, but they have to deal with, is the fact that when calcium comes into cells, it usually causes cell signaling, right? And so if we just let it go in and bind to stuff, then it'll probably set off a whole chain of events in multiple ways. And so instead, there's these special binding proteins within cells, and that's what that calbindin is there. And so that grabs onto calcium so it doesn't set off a whole chain of events, right? Because it is so important for cell signaling, right? And then it can come off of that and be completely taken from that intestinal cell back into the blood, right? To be fully absorbed. Okay. So yeah, and so when we look at when we look at the calcium pool there, like it shows here, we really have two primary types. We have calcium. When we look over here in the bone, we have the exchangeable portion of the calcium in our bone, which this is really calcium that's found in the endoplasmic reticulum of those osteocytes. Okay, so like it says there, the ER of osteocytes. Okay, so that's the readily exchangeable type, right? So those cells can be stimulated to pump out calcium, send it out into the blood. Okay, but that's only a small amount, but then there's a very large amount of stable calcium, and that's the stuff that's just making up the bone itself. Right, so that's the calcium phosphate salts in bone. Okay, so when we want to pull that calcium out of bone, we have to either stimulate the endoplasmic reticulum to release it, or we need to break down that stable supply. Okay, like I said before, calcium is found, or it's filtered into the filtrate in the kidneys, which is the start of the urine production. But then mostly all of that is brought back. Mostly all of that is reabsorbed by the cells that line the kidney tubules, so we don't lose it. But that is one way we can control calcium levels, by changing the amount of reabsorption that we get in the kidneys. We can decrease that reabsorption to get rid of calcium, or we can increase that reabsorption to save more calcium. Okay. Yeah, so then just looking at these mechanisms here. All right, so this is another way that we're using the sodium gradient again to use secondary active transport to move calcium from this is the actual GI tract up here, right, where the food's going through. This would be the blood or the extracellular fluid down there, right? So we get calcium in this way, but then again, we're using the sodium gradient to use secondary active transport to pump calcium back to the blood. Okay. Or it can be done with a magnesium exchange along with some ATP as well. Okay, so just two different mechanisms that are used to bring that calcium out of that intestinal cell back into the blood.
Still secondary active transport.
Yeah, it's a good question. I know, and it shows both like that. Yeah, I actually don't know what that would be categorized as, because it does both. I think it's probably actually just primary active transport, because they're probably both moving against their concentration gradient, because magnesium, we'll see in a sec, is yeah, so there's a lot of magnesium in cells. So yeah, so good point, Billy. That I skipped. Yeah, so that is actually primary active transport, but it's just moving two ions at the same time, but they're both going against their gradient in that case. Yeah.
With the sodium lysine.
Say that again. This one over here is secondary. Yeah, and this will be primary. Yeah. Good. Other questions on that? Okay. All right, so then let's talk a little bit about phosphate and magnesium first, and we'll spend some more time with calcium later. So phosphorus is regulated along with calcium for the most part. Okay, and because when we look at bone, the primary salt that makes up the hard part of bone is calcium phosphate. Okay, so obviously some key roles in the body: ATP, modification of proteins, DNA, RNA, all nucleic acids have a lot of phosphate in them. Okay, cyclic AMP, right, very important for cell signaling, right? There's cyclic GMP as well. All of those cell signaling pathways are not possible without phosphate. And then the intracellular buffering system, our primary extracellular buffering system, like we talked about, is that bicarbonate buffering, but our primary intracellular buffering system is this phosphate buffering system that's shown there. Okay, so those are just some roles of phosphate in the body. And then just like calcium, it's filtered in the kidneys. And again, that we haven't got to the kidneys yet, so we don't know necessarily exactly what that means. But again, that means that when our filtrate is created, if you remember the little glomerulus, how many people remember the glomerulus? Little capillary bed that's super leaky, right? We're sending blood into that. It squeezes the fluid out, right? That becomes the filtrate. So when something is filtered, it means it goes with that fluid, right? And it goes into little tubules that are eventually going to create urine. Okay, but at first they're called filtrate. So phosphate is filtered in the kidneys, just like calcium. Okay, but then again, most of it is reabsorbed again with the help of that sodium concentration gradient with sodium co-transporters. Okay, and those are shown here. Okay, so these are sodium co-transporters. And we can see one over here in this little image. See, it's sodium phosphate, and then different types of transporters there. Okay. One interesting part about this is PTH, parathyroid hormone, inhibits inhibits this process. So pretty much it takes the sodium phosphate channels and pulls them back into the cell of the kidney tubules. So we're not pulling as much phosphate back. Okay, so then that means less reabsorption of phosphate under the influence of parathyroid hormone, which means we're going to excrete more in the urine. Okay, we see similar channels in the small intestine, and those are activated by that vitamin D based steroid hormone. Yeah, calcitrol is the easier name for it. That's like cholecalciferol, I think is how you say it, but calcitrol is the easier name for that. But again, I'll have that written on a slide in a sec here. Okay, so then magnesium, again, like we just said, it's the second most abundant cation, so positively charged ion inside of cells. What's the most abundant? Yeah, no, sodium inside of cells? Potassium, right? Yeah, potassium. Yeah, so potassium inside, sodium outside. But our second most abundant positively charged ion inside of cells is magnesium. Okay, so lots of important physiological roles you can see there. We bring it in the GI tract. Okay, it gets reabsorbed in the kidneys. Parathyroid hormone increases its reabsorption in the kidneys. Okay, so it's actually the opposite of parathyroid hormone's effect on phosphate reabsorption in the kidneys. Okay. Okay. Questions on any of that so far? So here we see parathyroid hormone decreases reabsorption of phosphorus in the kidneys, but parathyroid hormone increases reabsorption of magnesium in the kidneys. Yeah, yeah, good. Okay. Okay, so then let's look at these vitamin D based hormones here. Okay, so this pathway is just kind of interesting. The formation of these hormones relies on 3 different tissues to do it for us. Okay, so first of all, we need sunlight, right? So we start out way up here. You don't need to memorize these names, but this is happening inside of our skin cells, right? They're called keratinocytes, right? The cells that make up the barrier for our skin, called keratinocytes. So they have the right enzymes to do this under the influence of sunlight, right? So then that gets us down to this cholecalciferol first, which is vitamin D3, okay? And then that is going to go out into the blood, and then it's going to circulate to the liver, right? And then we go through another round of enzymes, breaking this down, turning it into 2 separate things here, right? So 2 different options, 2 different pathways that are used, and then both of these are released, this is released into the blood, and then there's 2 different pathways that can go through in the kidneys, right? So then the kidney cells are now doing this job of turning it into our final 3 hormones here, okay? But the most important one is this one right here. Okay, and that one is the one that's called, the shortened version of it is calcitriol. Okay, so that's the most active version of this. But again, we're using the skin cells, the liver, and then the kidney cells to make this hormone, make all 3 of these hormones. Okay, so yeah, and so vitamin D is used to do this. Vitamin D increases the active transport of calcium and phosphate in the intestines. Okay, so we're going to bring more calcium and phosphate into the body under the influence of vitamin D. Okay, and these hormones here, this calcitriol. Okay, so we get this in our diet. Obviously, the sunlight is needed, like it shows there, like we just talked about. Okay, so here's all the actions there. Activates transcription of those calbindin proteins. Right, that one that was inside of the intestinal cells that makes sure calcium doesn't mess with anything when it's in the cell, right? So we get more of those with this. Also activates the calcium ATPases, as well as those transport channels that help us pull calcium into the cell. And then secondly, to pull it out of the cell back into the blood, right? So this is activating all of those channels. Okay. Also going to stimulate calcium reabsorption in the kidneys via another version of that same channel. Okay, so it's helping us bring more calcium in from the GI tract. It's helping us pull more of it back from the urinary system. Okay, and then it's going to increase activity of both osteoblasts. Oh, that's funny. One of those should be class. Sorry, there. One just changed the B for a C. Doesn't matter which one, but yeah. So it actually activates activity of both of those cells. We'll get into what those cells do more in a sec, but the osteoblasts are the one creating new bone for us, right? And the osteoclasts are the ones reabsorbing bone, that breakdown of bone process. And it seems a little strange that it activates both of them, but and in in my undergrad class, I don't even tell them that because it seems too confusing. It's always easier to think one does osteoblast, one does osteoclast. And we'll see something similar with parathyroid hormone. But the idea here is when we would need to remodel bone, make it stronger, make it more able to withstand certain forces, we need to break down part of it first, and then we kind of need to remodel it to make it stronger, right? So this is pretty much just causing that process to happen. Okay, and then also activates both phosphate and calcium channels in the GI tract, so we increase absorption. Go ahead. Yeah.
I know you mentioned that you don't want us to memorize it, but
Yeah.
are there any aspects of it you want us to know, like the sunlight?
Definitely the sunlight's important. Yeah. Yeah. But I would just say that knowing that those three different tissues help us do this, right? So knowing that the skin, the liver, and the kidneys are involved, and sunlight's involved, that's what I would say. I mean, you definitely need to know the name of this, yeah, because this is the primary hormone that we're talking about here. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Okay. Other questions on that? Okay, so then the regulation of this hormone here is high calcium and phosphate inhibit the formation of calcitriol. Okay, so that makes sense because these things, this hormone is helping us increase those levels, right? So if we already have high levels of those, then we don't need as much of this. Okay, but then low calcium, low phosphate, or high parathyroid hormone stimulates more of the production and release of this hormone. Okay, so think of vitamin D related hormones as something that's helping us increase our blood calcium levels. Okay, questions about any of that? Okay, so vitamin D deficiency is somewhat common in developing nations. And so there is dietary deficiency as well as sunlight deficiency versions of this. Okay, in kids, it causes rickets. Okay, rickets is the when bones are softened, right, and they're actually too soft, so not enough calcium phosphate salts in those bones. Bones have both a organic component and an inorganic component. The inorganic component is the calcium phosphate. The organic component is mostly collagen-based proteins, right? And so if there's too much of the organic component, not enough of that inorganic component, then bones are much softer and too flexible. Okay, so yeah, the typical cause again is either dietary deficiency of vitamin D or lack of sunlight. So in developing nations where this is somewhat more common, it's typically the dietary side of things, not the sunlight side of things. Okay, in adults, if you have vitamin D deficiency or sunlight deficiency, it causes what's called osteomalacia. Okay, which still is softening of bone, but doesn't have quite the same effects because bones aren't in the process of growing much anymore. And so it can lead to more fractures and things like that, but you don't see, especially vertebral fractures and other things, but you don't see as the same kind of bowing of the legs and things like that. That's more due to the fact of having not enough calcium phosphate salts while those bones are trying to grow. Okay, and rickets is reversible if it's caught early enough, and even if it's not caught super early, it can still be reversed somewhat, but there might be some growth problems that aren't overcome if they've been in that state for too long, but it can be reversible for the most part. Okay, questions on that at all? Okay, so let's talk about parathyroid gland and parathyroid hormone. Okay, so or if we look at this little flow chart here, this shows us the kind of steps as far as the release of parathyroid hormone. Okay, so it's going to be stimulated by low blood calcium levels. Okay, that's going to stimulate the parathyroid glands to increase the release of PTH. Okay, and then we see that increase in the plasma, right? And then down below there is all the actions of parathyroid hormone. Okay, so number one, we increase bone resorption. Right, so again, that means break down some bone, or at least tell those osteocytes to release calcium from their endoplasmic reticulums, and that's going to increase calcium in the blood. Okay, but then we have increased calcium reabsorption in the kidneys, right? So that means we're losing less of it in the urine. Okay, and then we're going to make more of that vitamin D, the group of vitamin D based hormones, calcitriol for the most part. Okay, and then that is going to cause an increase in calcium absorption in the intestines. Okay, so those three things are really like the trio that we want if our calcium levels are too low, right? We want to pull some calcium from the blood, we want to pull more in from the GI tract, and we don't want to lose it in the urine, right? So parathyroid hormone is doing all three of those things for us, indirectly for the absorption one through calcitriol, but yeah, catching it all three ways. Okay. Interesting thing about this one is it was discovered by accident. Its importance was discovered by accident, and primarily when somebody would have a thyroid tumor, and part of that, and physicians or surgeons would remove that tumor, and then remove, kind of by mistake, remove the parathyroid glands as well, because it's just these little collections of tissue on top of the thyroid in 4 different spots. But if you remove all of this, it can kill the patient, because parathyroid hormone is that crucial for calcium homeostasis. So yeah, so there's special types of cells in those parathyroid glands called the chief cells, and their job is to produce and secrete parathyroid hormone. Okay. Yeah, and the actions are all over here. So this is just kind of showing how it acts. Okay, so it's an it binds extracellularly. Okay, goes through a process here to stimulate the endoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. Yeah, but then it can also stimulate the resorption of bone as well. Okay. Questions on that at all? So we're hitting it from the 3 sides: increase in absorption in the GI tract, decreasing reabsorption in the kidneys, as well as increasing bone cells releasing calcium. Yeah, go ahead.
Is it considered resorption when it's doing the quick endoplasmic reticulum resorption?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, it still is always called that, and so probably part of that is just the fact that it's probably impossible to tell exactly where it's coming from unless it's like labeled in some way or something, but it still is always called that. So yeah, it's a great question. Yeah. Okay. All right, so parathyroid pathologies. Okay, hypoparathyroidism can lead to low calcium, as well as hyperexcitability of nerves. Okay, and then at the same time, this leads to high phosphate levels. Okay, and it leads to a condition called tetany, which is really just hyperexcitability of muscles. Okay, and the physiology of this is that normally the normal level of calcium on the outside of cells has some level of interaction with the sodium channels that leads to them not being as open. So the sodium leak channels that are normally there, that allows a little bit of sodium to leak into cells normally, without that calcium, then that actually opens up those leak channels a little bit more and causes a little bit more leakage of of sodium, which then brings us closer to our action potential threshold, right? It slightly depolarizes neurons and muscle cells and makes it easier for muscle cell contraction, right? And so there's 2 primary signs that are used for this. Okay, so Chvostek sign right here. This is contraction of the facial muscles with just a little bit of stimulation. Okay, so it's usually like a little bit of tapping or just kind of rubbing on the face, and it kind of leads to this contraction of those muscles, and then Trousseau's sign, which is flexing all of the or contracting all those flexor muscles in the wrist and the hand, and it can just kind of be stuck like that. And yeah, so those are signs of that tetany or hyperexcitability. On the other side of things, hyperparathyroidism is typically from a parathyroid tumor, and we're releasing too much parathyroid hormone. This can lead to very high calcium and low phosphate, and this is usually not symptomatic.
Is this also the also not with the tetanus is
Tetanus, yeah, it's the same root word involved.
Like if someone would do that state of like tetanus, would they like test for this?
Not as extreme, yeah, not as extreme. This would be more localized to certain areas like the facial muscles and the arm. Whereas tetanus can be like your whole body as well as your diaphragm, right, which is the life-threatening part of it. But yeah, so it's same idea, the muscles contracting, but it's just not as extreme. Yeah, good question. Okay. Yeah, and then another interesting thing that you guys might have seen in the book as well is that hypercalcemia, high calcium levels in the blood, is sometimes a sign for cancer. And it's just kind of this interesting thing that certain types of cancer, bone cancer makes sense, but then breast cancer, kidney cancer, ovarian cancer, skin cancer, all of these a lot of times lead to high calcium levels in the blood. Okay, and the main reason for that is because these cells secrete certain these cells that are cancer secrete certain cytokines, right? So immunoactive proteins that actually can mimic parathyroid hormone activity, right? So they can actually bind to parathyroid hormone receptors and have the same effects that parathyroid hormone could have, and so they're called parathyroid hormone-like proteins. And so that's the primary reason why these cancers can be associated with high calcium levels. Okay, questions on that? All right. Okay, so then let's talk about calcitonin. So calcitonin is via these parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland. Okay, so still within the thyroid gland, but they're not. Remember, the follicular cells were the ones that were kind of surrounding those little open like basket areas, and that's where the thyroid hormones were made. But then there's other ones kind of scattered around throughout the thyroid gland, and that's the parafollicular cells. Okay, so these are stimulated to release calcitonin under the condition of high blood calcium. Okay, and the actions are to decrease blood calcium as well as phosphate, blocks resorption of calcium from the bone by inhibiting those osteoclasts. Okay, and then it increases calcium excretion in the urine, so that would do that by decreasing reabsorption of calcium in the urine. Okay, but like I said before, this doesn't play a major role under normal physiological conditions, and we're totally fine without it. Okay. All right. Okay, and then so just a little bit about bone physiology here. A couple things. So again, as I was saying, bone is really a mix of collagen and then crystallized calcium phosphate salts, right? So we've got this is the inorganic part, right? And then the collagen part is the organic part. Okay, and so when we look at the balance of those, it's typically about 1/3 versus 2/3 of so 1/3 organic, right, protein, and then 2/3 inorganic. All right, that's kind of a typical balance, but those proportions vary, and that's going to change the stiffness and flexibility of the bone, right? So the more collagen side we get, the more flexible that bone is, right? The more inorganic side we get, the more stiff and rigid that bone is, and that can vary depending on which bone we're talking about as well, right? Certain bones, our ribs are quite flexible, right? But then other bones are not so flexible, right? So it varies on depending on which bone we're talking about. Okay, and then if we look at bone, there's really two primary parts to it. Okay, so the very outside of bone is made up of what's called compact bone. Okay, compact bone, also known as cortical bone, is made up of a bunch of these little cylindrical things called osteons. Okay, so if you look kind of right here on this image, you can see all these little cylinders kind of wrapped around each other. You can see that out here as well, right? All those are osteons, and so there are these layers of of bone that are woven, that have collagen woven in, as well as, oh yeah, and you can see it even better down here. You can see those concentric circles have collagen woven into that, as well as those calcium phosphate salts. And they're right in the center of each of those is a little central canal. That's where blood vessels and nerves pass through, right? So you can see the blood vessels passing through there. Okay. Bone is actually a very highly vascularized tissue. Right. Has anybody seen an open fracture, compound fracture before? Seen one? Yeah. Did you have that experience? You actually like saw like the blood kind of just like pouring out of the bone? Or, yeah, it's pretty, it's memorable, right? Yeah, yeah, for sure. I had that experience working a football game when I was in college, working as an athletic trainer, and yeah, during a kickoff, this is on JV, and JV is always dangerous because you've got the kids that have hit puberty and they're big and strong, the kids that haven't, right, and they're going up against each other, right, and so kickoff's the worst too because they're running at full speed at each other, right, and this little guy just got taken out. And by the time I got out there, he was super calm. I think he was going into shock, and he was just like, I think I broke my leg. He was laying there. I'm like, I don't think so, man. Like, you're not even crying. And I looked, and I just was looking down the shaft of his tibia. It was just right there. I was just like, same thing with you? Yeah. Really? No way. That's awesome. Maybe we were at the same game. Probably not. Yeah, pretty crazy. But it was literally just this like dark red blood just kind of pouring out of his tibia. And yeah, so bone is just very, very highly vascularized, lots and lots of blood vessels within it. Even though we don't think of it as a very active and blood-filled tissue, it really is. So yeah, interesting. That's the same story. I love it. That's great. Yeah, so the other interesting part, osteocytes are connected to each other via, and you can see the little osteocytes here. So it's kind of hard to see because it's pretty small, but all of the little, all these little kind of reddish things that almost look like little bugs, right? Those are the osteocytes. And then they're connected via these little tiny, like, that looks like the little bug's arms, right, in this image. Those are canaliculi, which are just little mini canals that connect the osteocytes to each other, as well as connect those osteocytes to the blood supply as well, right? And osteocytes have gap junctions, just like cardiac muscle cells do. So the osteocytes that are too far away from the blood supply actually get their nutrients past, since this one's nice and close, right? It sends nutrients to this one and then over to this one, right? Via gap junctions, connecting through those little canaliculi, which are just like little mini canals. Okay. Okay. So that's all through compact bone. And then when we look on the inside, the spongy bone here in the middle, this is again what's on the background of this slide, of these slides, and also known as trabecular bone. Okay, and that also is filled with osteocytes as well, but it's much less dense. It's not as compact. And yeah, questions on that? Looks like some of you were trying to figure out something I wrote, maybe. Yeah, you got it. Got it worked out. Did everybody get it? Okay, yeah, gap junctions. Yeah. Okay. Okay, and then we have connective tissue layers on the outside. We have out here is called periosteum, and that's kind of our layer that houses blood vessels and nerves. So that's why we see so many blood vessels and nerves out here. It's kind of all housed into the periosteum, connective tissue layer on the outside. And then again, the different cells here that are involved. So osteoblasts are responsible for making bone, so laying down new bone. Osteoclasts are responsible for resorbing bone or breaking down bone. And then osteocytes are the kind of maintenance cells. Uh-huh.
Connect the osteocytes to each other, or osteocytes?
The osteocytes to each other, yeah. So there's like these, they can connect the osteocytes to each other, but then also to the blood supply as well.
But then also the osteons so the osteons do not interact with those canaliculi.
No, there's osteo. So this is looking within within the osteon. So this is an osteon right here.
So the osteon is like the function.
osteon is just like this cylindrical unit. We have a bunch of those throughout bone. And then within that, we have osteocytes, we have canaliculus, we have collagen, we have calcium phosphate. We have the central canal with the blood vessel and nerves, blood
So they
vessels.
contain the osteocytes, other stuff.
Yeah, good clarification, Kim. Yeah. The one interesting part about the osteocytes is most of them started as osteoblasts, right? And when they start releasing all the stuff that turns into bone, they kind of just lock themselves in, right? Because they're creating this hard matrix around them. And then they just kind of lock themselves in, and they're no longer osteoblasts. They're just turned into osteocytes. And then when we're building new bone, those osteoblasts are kind of in that region, build more bone, lock themselves in, and they just kind of convert into osteocytes. Okay, this is just kind of an interesting thing at how osteoclasts work. You can see these osteoclasts are large cells. They're multinucleated cells. They make a lot of proteins, a lot of enzymes to help us break down bone. And what they do is actually grab onto a section of bone, and then they seal themselves off, right? They kind of create this sealing matrix all around the spot that they kind of suck onto, kind of like this big amoeba. And then they're just releasing all of these intense chemicals that are going to break down bone, drop the pH really low, as well as releasing enzymes that can break that down. And then they're kind of just sucking all that stuff back up into them. And then eventually makes this kind of divot in the bone where they've created that. Okay. Questions on any of that? Okay, so bone pathologies. Yeah, this is probably a good spot to take a short break and let the group do their presentation. I hate stealing your thunder though. I don't want to do that. So I'll just fill in anything I might need to here afterwards, but I'm sure it won't be much. Okay, so let's take a 5-minute break while they get set up, and then we'll come back and have the presentation. Yeah, and then the other one that's different from this, kind of the opposite of this, is the osteopetrosis. And osteopetrosis is just pretty much the opposite. It's too dense of bone, and it's not necessarily too much osteoblastic activity, but it's typically a problem with the osteoclast not being able to do their job, just having ineffective osteoclast. And so one of the big kind of problems with that is that all the little canals that we have in our skeletal system that allow things like blood vessels and nerves and muscles and tendons and things to pass through get too small, right? And so there's lots of surrounding issues with that. Yeah, Kim? That's a good question. Yeah. I don't know if there's a direct connection there, but I bet there probably is. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there was. But yeah, maybe Google it and let us know a little bit later. Yeah, yeah, that's a great connection. Yeah. Okay, yeah, and then just this term involutional. I don't know if you ladies mentioned that one or not, but that's just kind of what that means is osteoporosis due to aging, which is just the most common type. So it's just this term that you might see when discussing osteoporosis. So, okay. The next slide just has a little bit of a recap on the different things that we've talked about so far. So go ahead and hop over to that and start kind of filling that in. It's really looking at each of the hormones in regards to calcium and then in regards to phosphate and magnesium, and just kind of think about how each try to connect how each of the hormones we talked about affects those three minerals. We'll come back together here in a sec. All right, let's go ahead and come back together here. So we need to keep moving on. But I just wrote in kind of the shorthand version of what happens here. There's definitely the most going on with calcium. We talked about that one the most, obviously. So parathyroid hormone, again, does those three things. It increases bone resorption, which is going to increase blood calcium. It increases kidney reabsorption, and it increases calcitriol release. And then calcitriol causes increased calcium absorption in the GI tract, right? Also causes increased calcium reabsorption in the kidneys, and then just overall causes bone remodeling. Okay, so that's definitely the most powerful effect there that we see. Calcitonin inhibits resorption, right? So it kind of does the opposite of that. And it increases our release of calcium in the kidneys by blocking reabsorption. Okay, with phosphate, calcitonin decreases phosphate levels by blocking reabsorption. Okay, calcitriol increases absorption in the GI tract, so that increases phosphate levels, and then parathyroid hormone decreases reabsorption as well, and so that also decreases phosphate levels. And then lastly, magnesium, we just talked about parathyroid hormone increasing reabsorption in the kidneys and increasing our magnesium levels there. That's the only one we talked about. Yeah, there's probably others, but yeah, that's the only one. Okay, questions about any of that? Give you another sec to finish writing that down. I always think the bone stuff isn't going to take that long, and it always takes a long time. Not sure why. Okay. How you doing? Anybody still need more time? Just raise your hand. You're good? Okay. All right. So we're going to move on to female sex hormones in the menstrual cycle. Okay. And so, yeah, we're going to start out with the process of oogenesis, which is really the formation of egg cells. Okay. And so this all begins with the stem cells of eggs called the oogonium. And this is happening during fetal life in females. Okay. Increasing the stem cell size and population makes somewhere around 6 to 7 million of these oogonia cells. Okay. This all stops right before birth. Okay. And this is mitosis, right? So this is when cells are dividing and we're adding more of those stem cells. Okay. And then meiosis is also going to start before birth. Okay. Meiosis 1, all the egg cells are stuck in meiosis 1 all the way up until they get recruited for ovulation. Okay. Some of those resume during puberty, and then some stay paused for the whole 50 years of their lifespan. Okay. And then some will start meiosis 2. Okay, but then they'll stop in metaphase, which is just one of the cell cycles, until fertilization happens. And then once fertilization happens, that's what allows for the last step in meiosis to happen, which is the second division of eggs. So remember, mitosis, we get one cell division. Meiosis, there's meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, which is 2 separate cell divisions. That's how at the end of meiosis 2 end up with 4 cells, right? Those haploid cells that have half the number of chromosomes. And we can see that here, right? See that on this little image here. So meiosis 1, we're going from 44 chromosomes, eventually down to 22. So those haploid cells, right? And then upon fertilization, the other 22 plus the sex chromosome, that's why it's not 23 there, is then added to the egg cell to get back to the number of chromosomes, the 23 pairs of chromosomes. Okay, each time the egg cell goes through cell division, there's another one that's just called the polar body that comes off, right? And that one just kind of dies off, right? So then there's just kind of one that moves on each time that's the viable actual cell. Okay. This idea of atresia is this idea that women are not making more egg cells after birth, right? So there's just the number of egg cells is slowly declining, right? But this is a lot, right? So this is definitely a lot more than is needed, but it's probably typically only around somewhere around 300 to 500 that may be ovulated over a lifetime. But they're not, but women aren't making more throughout their lifetime. This is not the cause of menopause. That was initially one of the ideas of what might be leading to menopause, is when a woman runs out of eggs. That's definitely not the case, but it has more to do with the responsiveness of those egg cells and the and the ovaries to GnRH, like gonadotropin releasing hormone, and yeah. And so during menopause, there's definitely a lack of estrogen and progesterone secretion because of that lack of responsiveness to GnRH, which then eventually can lead to high LH and FSH. And that's kind of what we see with menopause. So this perimenopausal age is somewhere around 45 to 55, and then the average age to start menopause is right around 51. Okay. So that's just kind of a quick overview there on that. Yeah, questions on that at all? Okay, so then when we look at the follicle, and this is inside of an ovary, right? And we look at this ovarian cycle is really the stages that the ovaries go through, and really the stages that the follicles go through. So the follicle is a structure that we find around the eggs, right? And the eggs on the inside, and the ovary contains a bunch of these. Okay, and so we can just kind of look through these different ones. This is looking at an ovary here, and it shows follicles all in different stages. Okay. And so we can just kind of walk through this together. So the early part is called the primordial follicle. That one is the one labeled as B there. Okay. So we see these little follicles, really just a single layer of cells around the eggs, around the egg cell. Okay. And then that one can start developing a little bit more. To be known, the next step is called the antral follicle, and that's what we see in D. Okay. So it starts growing, right? So those follicular cells that are surrounding the egg start growing. And so we get lots more cells around, as well as some space on the inside. And that's really what the follicle is that open space on the inside. Okay. And then eventually it turns into a full-blown, what's known as a mature or Graafian follicle. And that's the one we see in E there. Okay. So big follicle, lots of cells around, and that big space on the inside is called the antrum. Okay, and then from there, the corpus hemorrhagicum is what we see in A. And what that is right after ovulation, right? So the egg has been released here, and there's actually some blood associated with that follicle. And that's kind of what this bluish look is just a little bit of blood that is released with that, with ovulation. And so now the follicle is still there, but the egg has been released, right? So this is post-ovulation. Okay, and so then what we have left over after the blood has cleared is called the corpus luteum. Okay, and the corpus luteum is what we see in H. Okay, so this right here, or sorry, not, yeah, this or in this, both of those are just different stages of the corpus luteum. Really, all three of these are different stages of the corpus luteum. It changes size over its time. And then lastly, when the corpus luteum dies off, then it's called the corpus albicans, and that's just kind of what's left over after the corpus luteum has died off. Okay, and the corpus luteum is changing size, and that's dependent on VEGF, which is just stands for vascular endothelial growth factor. So it's a growth factor that's released that leads to blood vessels coming into the corpus luteum and giving it extra nutrients to grow. Okay, we're going to look at these different cell types in the follicle. We can see there's granulosa cells, there's these thecal cells, and then the fluid on the inside. But these two different cell types have different functions. We'll talk about those in one sec. Yeah.
What is
F, was that not one that I yeah, what is oh yeah, that's called the those are the follicles that started to develop, but then didn't actually get fully recruited for ovulation. So they're called, I guess I don't have that name on here. Yeah, those are called, let me just write it down here. They're called the atretic follicles. Okay, so during the process of leading towards ovulation, multiple follicles kind of rise up and they're ready to go, but then only one actually gets fully recruited. So those atretic follicles are the ones that started to rise up, started to grow, but then didn't actually go through the ovulation process. Okay, so we see those granulosa cells are the ones that are going to be releasing estrogen. And the thecal cells are releasing androgens, which are estrogen-like or testosterone-like hormones, but these are going to get converted into estrogen as well. We'll talk about that process here in a sec. Okay, so that's just kind of all the stages of development of the follicle, really known as the ovarian cycle. Okay, questions on any of those? Go ahead, Billy.
just the importance of knowing the VGEF?
Yeah, it's
Is that just
not so much the VEGF, but just the idea that the growth of the corpus luteum and the health of the corpus luteum is dependent on it getting a blood supply. And that's what vascular endothelial growth factor does. It leads to blood vessels formation in that corpus luteum.
And during that time, that's just the follicular phase of just different parts of the body, right?
Say that one more time.
While that corpus luteum is growing,
Mm-hmm.
there's no other like intrinsic on the ovary happening other than just other hormones are being secreted like through that follicular phase, right?
Yeah, follicular phase, also known as the luteal phase, right? And so that's when we're getting a lot of progesterone release, but also estrogen. And the primary source of those hormones is that corpus luteum. So we got to keep the corpus luteum alive and healthy in order to do that. And so the blood vessel growth is the key to that. Yeah. Thanks. Good clarification. Other questions on that so far? Okay. All right. So, oh yeah, sorry. You don't need to see that because we wrote them all in. Okay. All right. So menstrual cycle, we're going to talk about all the stages of this here. There's multiple ways to look at it. Okay. So if we're looking at it from the perspective of what's happening in the uterus, then there's 3 uterine phases. Okay. And we can see those right here. Right. If we're looking at it from the perspective of what's happening in the ovaries, then there's 2 phases. Okay, so the 3 uterine phases are either the menstrual, proliferative, or the secretory. Okay, so that's what's happening in the uterus during that time. Either menstruation's happening, right? That's when the bleeding is occurring, the sloughing off of the endometrium, or proliferation, growth of the endometrium, thickening of those walls, or the secretory phase, which is more mucus. It's already grown, it's already thick, but now it's just releasing mucus, preparing for potential implantation. Okay. But if we look at it in terms of just ovarian phases, then it's really just 2. It's either the follicular phase or the luteal phase. And we just talked about what's going on there, right? It's either the corpus luteum or it's the follicle, which includes the egg and those follicular cells around it. Okay. But when we talk about the menstrual cycle, then it kind of combines those 2 into 4 phases, right? So the menstrual cycle phases include the menstrual phase. Okay. Follicular, which can also be called proliferative. Ovulatory phase, so that adds another one. So we're adding the ovulation, and there's not really a phase, really just one. It is a phase, but it's just one kind of moment. Okay, and then the last one is either called luteal or secretory. Okay, so you can see how the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle are kind of combining both the uterine phases and the ovarian phases in different ways. Third one is ovulatory, yes. Okay, go ahead.
So, where is the corpus luteum at that point of the secretory phase? Is it
So, no, the corpus luteum is still in the ovary.
exerting it?
And it's still releasing hormones, releasing progesterone, estrogen, maintaining the endometrium, doing all the other effects. We'll talk about those effects soon here. Yeah. Okay. So the luteal and secretory phases are really happening during the same time. It's just kind of a different perspective, right? We're talking about what the ovaries are doing versus we're talking about what the endometrium is doing, or the uterus. Okay. And then follicular and proliferative are kind of used interchangeably, but you can see that they're not perfectly overlapping each other, right? It includes the menstrual phase as well, but yeah. Okay, one thing we'll talk more about what the uterus is doing, but as far as what the changes in the cervix, so the higher levels of estrogen that are present is causing thinning of the mucus, or sorry, of the cervix itself, which leads to a higher pH of mucus. Okay, and then the thinnest the cervix gets is right around ovulation. This is because that's when the peak of estrogen is as well. Okay, and then progesterone has the effects of making the cervix thicker. And so that would happen more during the luteal phase, because that's when we have the highest progesterone levels. Okay, so hopefully this image is helpful because it really kind of shows everything time aligned, what's happening in the ovaries, what's happening in the endometrium, what do we kind of call those things, and you can see the primary hormones involved in those. We'll get into the more detail here in a sec though. Okay, questions on any of that so far? Okay, so when it comes to estrogens, there's multiple types of estrogens released in females. Okay, all these different ones here. Okay, those are the three naturally occurring ones. Okay, the formation is dependent on aromatase. Okay, which is a certain enzyme, which can convert testosterone to estradiol, as well as androstenedione to estrone. Androstenedione is one of those androgens that can be released either by some of the cells in the ovaries or by the adrenal cortex, like we talked about last time. Okay, so the way this process works, so you can see this is a thecal cell and this is a granulosa cell. Okay, so we see androstenedione being produced in the thecal cell, which that's one of the androgens. It's a precursor to other sex hormones like estrogen or testosterone. We can see this, both of these cells require LDL, right? That's the source of cholesterol to make these steroid hormones, okay? But then the thecal cells are responding to LH by releasing androstenedione, okay? So in response to LH, they release androstenedione, but that androstenedione goes right over into the granulosa cell, and then that granulosa cell is going to convert it into, and we'll see right here. So it's sent to the granulosa cell, and that converts it into estrone, which then converts it into estradiol, right? And so those are both versions of these estrogen type hormones. And this is all dependent on the stimulation of the hormone FSH that came from the pituitary gland, right? So LH is causing these thecal cells to do their job, release androstenedione, and then FSH is causing these granulosa cells to do their job and cause the formation of estrogen. Okay. The mature granulosa cells also respond to LH and produce estrogen that way as well. And so we get lots of estrogen released towards the very end, and we'll see why that's important here in a sec. Okay, but the key thing here, LH causes thecal cells to release androstenedione. That goes right into the granulosa cells, and then with the stimulation of FSH, that causes androstenedione to be converted into estrogen, and then it gets released. Make sense? Okay. Other questions on that? Bless you. Okay, so then when we look at the effects of estrogens, okay, so lots of different effects: central nervous system effects, sex characteristics, muscle strength, cardiovascular, decreases in cholesterol, all the stuff in the menstrual cycle we're going to talk about, growth of the endothelium, bone health, like Cassie and Alejandro just talked about. Okay, and then there are multiple types of receptors. Okay, they're all intracellular nuclear receptors, right? Because this is a cholesterol-based hormone, so it can get through that cell membrane, get in and bind intracellularly. Okay, there's a couple different ones: estrogen receptor alpha, beta. Yeah, you don't need to know the difference between any of them for this class. Okay, but most of the effects are somehow regulating transcription, right? Somehow either causing more of a certain protein to be made or less of a certain protein to be made. Okay, somewhere around 35% of breast cancer is estrogen dependent. Okay, so a very common drug for breast cancer is tamoxifen. Okay, tamoxifen has estrogen-like effects, but it doesn't stimulate the cells in the breast, and it inhibits estrogen release. Okay, so meaning that this idea that breast cancer can be estrogen dependent means that the growth of that tumor is dependent on estrogen release. Okay, but this drug tamoxifen has some of the other effects of estrogen, but doesn't have the effects of making the tumor grow. So yeah.
Big estrogen that mimics effects of estrogen, does that also help prevent breast cancer?
Yeah, I don't know too much about the birth control piece, but I'm sure it's related to that. Definitely. And this is, yeah, and there's definitely connection to breast cancer and going through pregnancy. So women that never went through pregnancy have a higher risk of breast cancer, especially at a certain age. And it has to do with estrogen's effects on that as well. But yeah, I don't know a ton about the details of it. But yeah, and was it something you were referring to that certain types of birth control can actually be preventative of breast cancer? Yeah.
The birth controls have like the one that mimics estrogen.
Yeah,
So-
absolutely. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I haven't seen that exactly, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was the truth. Yeah. Yeah. Other drugs used are aromatase inhibitors, and this again had to do with the formation of, that was a key enzyme in the formation of estrogen. Okay. Also ovary removal is a potential treatment as well. Okay. So that's the effects of estrogen. Go ahead, Slee. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, my guess would be yes. Yeah, definitely not. Yeah, don't have the clinical experience to know exactly, but my guess would be yes. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Kim?
Yeah, I have a question. So in some of the quizzes, it highlighted which hormones were departing hormones and which
Uh-huh.
were not. If it uses an intracellular nuclear receptor, is that usually not?
Then it's never G protein. Yeah.
So no steroid hormones are ever deprotein.
Well, I don't know if I want to make that statement, but That's a good- yeah, I'm not sure. There's so many complicated things in the body that I probably won't make that statement. But for this class, yes, for this class, what you need to know, if it binds extracellularly and it sets off that second messenger system, it's a G protein coupled receptor. If it binds intracellularly, it's not G protein coupled.
So that there's not much you can do with the can't set up cascade within the nucleus.
Yeah, you don't need to because you're already in there affecting the nucleus transcription wise. Yeah, so yeah, great question. I love that you're thinking about that. Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's estrogen. Let's talk a little bit about progesterone. Okay. So secreted by the corpus luteum for the most part, right, as well as the placenta, and then a little even from the follicle before the egg is released. Okay. So again, that corpus luteum is just the follicle without the egg, right? Its release is stimulated due to LH binding to the corpus luteum. Okay, so again, LH dependent. LH is one of those pituitary hormones we talked about last time. Okay, so the actions on the uterus and vagina would be to increase mucus thickness. Okay, so release of thick mucus. Okay, in the breasts, it leads to preparation for milk production. Okay, one of the effects of it in the brain is to increase body temperature. And it's also going to increase ventilation, going to abbreviate that as VE. Okay, and that's going to decrease CO2 levels a little bit during this post-ovulatory phase in the cycle. Okay, there's a couple different progesterone receptor types as well, similar to estrogen. Yeah, so in that luteal phase is when we see this stuff. So this is when some breast swelling can happen during the menstrual cycle because of the effects of progesterone. Okay. All right. So then when we look at the kind of hormone cycle here with the during the different phases, we see hypothalamic hormone here starting off the whole thing. It's kind of hard to see there, but this is the GnRH one. Okay. So GnRH, growth gonadotropin releasing hormone. Right. That's going to go to the anterior pituitary, tell it to release FSH and LH, like we talked about last time. Right. So we talked about before how FSH is going to go to those granulosa cells, right? And then LH goes to the thecal cells. Okay, and remember FSH is being stimulated to convert those androgens into estrogen through the effects of the granulosa cells. Okay, we also see another hormone called inhibin being released here too, and that's part of what's providing negative feedback upstream. Okay, but then the estrogens themselves also provide negative feedback at this point upstream. Okay, so negative feedback to both the hypothalamus and the pituitary provided by inhibin and the estrogens. Okay, so that's kind of during most of the menstrual cycle, we're seeing that. Okay, but then when that follicle gets to its largest size, to its mature size, that Graafian follicle kind of looks like a little clown in that picture. It's a little nose and two eyes, but big smile. But when there's so many of these granulosa and thecal cells, and then remember, then LH starts actually being able to stimulate the granulosa cells, release estrogens as well at this point. Just get this huge rush of estrogen, right? This is when estrogen levels peak. And then there's something that switches that negative feedback that estrogen normally provides to positive feedback. And then all of a sudden there's a large rush of LH, a big surge of LH. Okay, because now estrogen, all that a massive amount of estrogen is causing an LH surge. And that's actually what stimulates ovulation. That's what leads to the follicle rupturing, ovulation of the egg, and the formation of the corpus luteum, right? So LH stands for what? What does it stand for? Luteinizing hormone, right? It luteinizes the follicle, right? It turns the follicle into the corpus luteum. Follicle stimulating hormone is the primary one that makes the follicle grow. It's called that because it stimulates the follicular growth. Okay, so then right when the corpus luteum is formed, now we get more progesterone release as well as still estrogens and inhibin. Then it kind of goes back to negative feedback again after that, and we can see that here. Okay, so that's kind of the general steps there and the effects of those hormones. All right, questions on that? Okay. All right, so then this is just kind of a summary of what we've really just talked about a few times, and this tells you what those female sex hormones do, what their primary roles are. Okay, the only one we hadn't talked about yet was relaxin. Relaxin is also produced by the corpus luteum as well as other glands. Okay, but one of its primary jobs is to relax ligaments, right? And so this is helpful opening up the pelvic joints as well as the pubic symphysis for pregnancy. Okay, but the other ones, other stuff we've already talked about. Oxytocin also has some of those same effects of relaxing ligaments and joints as well. Yeah. Okay, so here's what we're going to do for the menstrual cycle. So pretty much what I have here is each stage here. This is kind of presented in a 28-day cycle, which is not super common to have an exactly 28-day cycle, but it's the easiest way to kind of separate it out. And so each slide here shows a phase. So menstrual phase, days 1 through 5, kind of tells you what's going on there, right? If we go to proliferative phase, can also be called follicular phase, days 5 through 13, right? Tells you what's going on there in the hormone levels, okay? And then if we look at the ovulatory phase, right there in the middle of day 14, right? That's when ovulation happens, okay? And then lastly, the secretory, which is what's happening in the uterus, right? Secretion, or luteal phase, that's what's happening in the ovaries, the corpus luteum, okay, 15 through 28. Okay, and that is the most consistent time frame in the menstrual cycle, is that 2-week period that the corpus luteum lives. Okay, so what I want you guys to do is just kind of read through those 4 slides, and then kind of just go to these last slides and kind of just process what's happening with each of these hormones. And this can be as simple as, right, is this high or low? Is this going up or down with each of these? What's happening in the follicle? Is it growing? Did it just excrete the egg? Right. With the uterus, is it growing? Is it releasing mucus? Okay. So this would be a good way to just kind of work through this. So each of these phases, so menstrual, proliferative, ovulatory, secretory, luteal, and then these are just little slices. The little images are little slices of this bigger thing that shows you the graph of these hormones and what's happening with each one. Okay. So let's take 5 to 7 minutes and kind of walk through, you guys walk through with your partner all this stuff. Okay. All right. Go ahead and come back together here. Looks like most of you had been filling this out and you got most of the way through it. So let's just talk through this briefly here. So we'll start out with the menstrual phase, right? That's just the easiest time to know where someone's at, right? Because there's external bleeding at this point, right? So days 1 through 5, menstrual phase, we see, and pretty much always GnRH, LH, and FSH are going to be the same, right? Because one is stimulating the other two. Okay, so GnRH, LH, and FSH are low, but they're starting to rise at this point, right? Progesterone levels are decreasing, okay, and estrogen levels are decreasing. Right? What was the source of those two hormones? The corpus luteum from the previous cycle, which is now dying off, and it has died off, so that's why those hormone levels are dropping, right? So I just put CL in each of those times for corpus luteum as we move forward. Okay, so the follicle is still the corpus luteum, but it had just died off, right? And that's why we lost the levels of estrogen and progesterone. Okay, and that's what was the progesterone was keeping the endometrium alive, right? It was maintaining the endometrium. And so since it's not there anymore, endometrium sloughs off, and this leads to the menstruation. Okay, and the uterus, I just say endo dies, endometrium dies and comes off. Go ahead.
One of the slides that the follicles-
Say it one more time.
one of the slides mentioned the phase that the follicles have primary.
Mm.
Right there. Yeah.
Yeah, I see. So this is talking about so this one is talking about the last cycle, right? This one's talking about the new egg and follicle that's starting to grow to get going again. Yeah, good question. Yeah. Okay, so that's the menstrual phase. We move into the proliferative phase. Proliferation means growth, right? So we have growth in both the follicle and the uterus here, right? So we can see the follicle's getting bigger, heading towards that Graafian follicle, right? Uterus is thickening, adding blood vessels. That endometrial layer is growing, getting glands and blood vessels. Okay, GnRH, FSH, and LH are higher, right? They're rising here. Okay, progesterone levels are still very low because we don't have a corpus luteum yet, right? Estrogen levels are starting to rise. Okay, and the bigger that follicle gets, the higher estrogen release we have. So those two things are directly connected because those follicular cells are the source of estrogen, right? So the more of them we have, the more estrogen release we have. What'd you call it? Yep.
It says on the slide that
Recruitment, yeah. So this is where there's multiple follicles, multiple eggs and follicles that kind of start rising up, getting ready for ovulation. But then only one of them actually makes it all the way to ovulation. So that recruitment period is multiple of them kind of get ready for ovulation, but then only one actually gets fully recruited. And recruitment means just the ones that are heading towards ovulation. Okay. Go ahead. Where does it say that? Probably here, recruitment of follicles. Yeah. Okay, and then we got moving into ovulation. So right at day 14, GnRH has a surge. Same with LH and FSH. Again, that was caused by positive feedback from estrogen. Okay, there's something about those really high estrogen levels that causes it to flip from negative feedback to positive feedback, leads to this big surge. Okay, progesterone levels are going to rise immediately after ovulation. Okay, estrogen levels are the highest they're ever going to be right here, right? And then they're immediately going to drop after ovulation. Okay, follicle is as big as it's going to be. It's releasing all that estrogen. Okay, and the uterus is still going through the growth process. It's still thickening. The endometrial layer is still getting bigger. Okay, and again, LH is the one that is causing ovulation.
So you say that's very high, but then it drops. So would you say that in the ovulatory phase, estrogen is high?
It's as high as it's going to get. Yeah, but since it's just a one-day thing, it's kind of like it's super high, and then just immediately after it drops super
But it
fast.
drops the same phase.
No, I mean it's right after ovulation. Yeah, so just kind of, but ovulation is just a very brief moment in time. So if you're counting a whole day, then you're kind of counting the high part, and then it's dropping by the end of that day as well. So, yeah. Okay. Other questions on that? Okay, then we move into our last phase, the secretory or luteal phase. This is the last 2 weeks. Okay, so GnRH, LH, and FSH are low in this because they're inhibited by the release of progesterone and estrogen. Okay, and progesterone levels are high here because of its release by the corpus luteum, as well as estrogen levels are relatively high here as well. Not as high as they were, but still somewhat high. Again, coming from the corpus luteum. The follicle now is the corpus luteum, right? There's no egg in it anymore. It's really just an endocrine organ now, right? It's this little endocrine organ releasing all these hormones. Okay. The uterus is now secreting lots of mucus, preparing for potential implantation. They both provide negative feedback to both the pituitary and the hypothalamus. Yeah. Okay. Questions on any of that? So that's kind of the key details of the menstrual cycle with each step there. Yeah. Any questions, clarifications? Yeah.
So. That mean you're just like, you run out of estrogen or like you cover to the estrogen, that's why you too much.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I know I've looked that up before, but I don't remember the details of that off the top of my head. Yeah. I'm sorry. I know. Yeah, it was definitely one that I had researched in the past, but it's not coming to me right now to understand that. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Any other questions? Say it again. Yeah, into the endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus, right? So the uterus has 3 layers to it: the endometrial layer, which is the interior layer, the myometrium, which is the muscle part, and then the parametrium, which is like the external layer that kind of protects it. So that inner layer is the endometrium where the implantation happens. Yeah, Audrey.
So during menstruation, cells also take out the egg at the same time.
Yeah, typically, yeah. Mhm.
So the egg travels down the fallopian tubes along with these hormones that are still being released by the ovaries.
Well, the hormones are actually released into the bloodstream. Yeah. Yeah, so if they were released into the fallopian tube, that would actually be considered not an endocrine gland, but an exocrine gland, right? Because then they'll be releasing into the reproductive tract. But also it goes into the interstitial space around the follicle and then picked up by the capillaries there and then sent into the blood.
When we talk about these effects, these are only the effects that it has in this area, but they also cause effects that are side effects of
All the hormones. Yeah, absolutely. Lots of other effects for sure. Yeah. Yep. Good questions. Okay, so this just puts that graph all together for you. The key determinants of the duration of the menstrual cycle are really 2 things: the life of the corpus luteum, which is pretty consistent around 2 weeks, but it's not always. Okay, and then the second one, the other primary determinant is just that follicular growth timeline. Like, how long does it take to get the follicle big enough to produce enough estrogen to stimulate positive feedback and stimulate ovulation, right? And those are the 2 things that really change to change the timing of the cycle. Menstruation and ovulation aren't really factors as far as the phases go in changing that 28-day cycle to something else. Okay. All right. So just a little bit about pregnancy. So one interesting note: the ideal time for intercourse, if pregnancy is the goal, is around 48 hours before ovulation. Okay. So the egg lives about 72 hours. Okay. After it's released. Okay. So about 3 days after ovulation, the egg is still there. All right. Sperm live about 120 hours. Okay. Not every single one, but there's still sperm there, enough sperm there at 120 hours after. And there's this rise in body temperature that occurs in females around 1 to 2 days after ovulation. Okay, and so that's kind of one of the key ways for the rhythm method of birth control, or the kind of self-monitoring of birth control is checking body temperature. So the quote unquote safe period, if pregnancy is not the goal, would be somewhere around 3 days after that temperature rise. Yeah, and all the way to the temperature drop, so it goes back down. And then just before the next period begins. And this is because that temperature rise happens 1 to 2 days after ovulation, and with the timing of the life of the egg and the life of the sperm, that's kind of the safe period there. So, but the rhythm method has varied results for sure. Yeah, so definitely not 100% birth control for sure. But yeah, so if fertilization happens, the egg implants in the upper 1/3 of the uterus, okay, and fertilization is typically going to happen in the fallopian tubes. In those, they're also called uterine tubes. Doesn't happen down in the uterus for the most part. It's usually the egg and the sperm meet up somewhere in the fallopian tubes typically. Okay, the placenta, we'll talk a little bit more about the blood flow in the placenta later when we get to the cardiovascular system. But it's kind of unique because it's the only organ in humans that's composed of 2 different people, right? And there's 2 different sides to it. Okay, so the mom side is called the decidua, and the fetal side is called the chorion. Okay, the chorion is releasing a special hormone called HCG, or human chorionic gonadotropin. All right, so its job is to now keep the corpus luteum alive even longer, right? So the corpus luteum normally only lasts 2 weeks, but if pregnancy does happen, then we get the stimulation from HCG to keep that corpus luteum alive for longer, for 2 to 3 months actually. And this point now, that's helping to keep the release of all those hormones that the corpus luteum releases, which helps keep the endometrium alive for even longer, obviously. Okay, and this is the one that's measured in pregnancy tests, is that HCG hormone. Okay, it also releases HCS, which is human chorionic somatomamotropin, which stimulates growth similar to growth hormone. So this kind of helps to redirect nutrients to the fetus, as well as stimulating milk production or the start of milk production in the female. Okay, next slide. All of our pregnancy tests. Yeah, we look a lot younger here. I know that was 13 years ago now. But when we found out about Christian here, that was Soren there, obviously here. But we told him that there was a baby in mommy's belly, and he pulled up her shirt and said, "Oh, I see it." What's that? Yeah, totally. Yeah, it is. You're right. Yeah, you're right for sure. This one was a sad one. Eve was a rough pregnancy. My wife had hyperemesis gravidarum during the pregnancy, so pretty much throwing up all day, every day, to the point where she had to go to the hospital multiple times to get IV fluids and nutrients. So it was rough. Yeah, really rough. She really couldn't get out of bed for much at all. But then she was still working, so she was teaching. She would literally like go throw up like on her breaks, and like have to get up in the middle of class and throw up sometimes, and it's terrible. Yeah, really, really bad. So she always says that luckily Eve was the last one, because she was going to be the last one no matter what. So yeah, so that was rough. But yeah, so hyperemesis gravidarum is a tough one to deal with. So just briefly about birth control. Different forms. There's synthetic estrogen, more commonly now estrogen and progesterone, kind of combo pills. Synthetic estrogen, since it gives negative feedback to the release of all those hormones up above, it's going to inhibit FSH, which then doesn't let the follicles grow, which then never gets to ovulation. Right? Estrogen and progesterone is going to really inhibit both FSH and LH. So again, stopping ovulation, but then also stopping implantation in case fertilization does happen, because the thick mucus production is not the same. But more commonly now, IUDs, and these have different things as well. Some of them are just made out of copper, which is a spermicide, so it can destroy the sperm as it comes in. Other ones actually release some progesterone, which then kind of thickens the mucus in the cervix and completely stops sperm entry. And then there's also tubal ligation, right, which is really just kind of putting a clamp on those fallopian tubes and not allowing the egg to get down or the sperm to get up. But yeah.
Okay, so my dating,
Oh, really? No way. Wow. That's wow. What type of IUD was it? Do you know? It was just copper. Okay, yeah. So that's maybe why they're moving to the hormone ones now or something. That's crazy. Thanks for sharing that. Wow. Wow. Yeah, Audrey. Yeah, I don't know for sure, but I would guess, yeah. And I would guess that's why they've kind of advanced it along the time. So yeah, and I don't know a ton about it, but yeah. Wow. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah.
Is tumor ligation reversible?
Yeah, it is reversible. I don't know if it's 100% reversible, but it definitely is something that can be reversed. Much more reversible than vasectomy in males. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about the male reproductive system here. Okay. We'll look at just kind of the basic anatomy first, and then talk a little bit about what everything does here. Okay. So we look at kind of the tubular system within the testes. If we start kind of all the way towards the back, it's the seminiferous tubules in the kind of deepest part. Okay. And so we can see that here. Okay, so those are just this series of convoluted tubes, and this is where sperm develop. Okay, moving on from there, moves into the epididymis. Okay, and the epididymis is a series of ducts. This is kind of again more of the posterior portion of the testes. Okay, and this is where sperm mature. Okay, so the initial development occurs in the seminiferous tubule, and then they kind of move on to throughout the maturation process more in the epididymis. So this next part up here. Okay. And then the vas deferens, the function there is to really connect the testes to the urethra. Okay, so we see the vas deferens here. So it's connecting that whole tubular system up to the urethra. Okay, so the vas deferens is surrounded by blood vessels, nerves, as well as smooth muscle. Okay, so during ejaculation, that smooth muscle contracts and moves the semen from really mostly the sperm at that point from the vas deferens up into the spermatocord. So vasectomy is one of the most effective types of birth control. So 99%, 99 to 100% effective birth control. If it is actually tested properly. So some males get a vasectomy, but then don't go through the right testing to make sure that it actually worked. And so that's where it might not be 100%, but if they actually go through the process of testing to make sure sterilization occurred, then it's 100% effective. But pretty much that is chopping out a section of the vas deferens. So vasectomy, right? Removing part of the vas deferens, and then just kind of cauterizing each side of that, and so it doesn't really connect anymore. Okay, it can be reversed, but it only works about half the time to reverse it. Okay, so a little bit about the process of the formation of sperm. So spermatogenesis. Okay, there's two primary cell types within the testes that we'll talk about, just like there were in the ovaries. Okay, so the Sertoli cells, these ones are releasing something called androgen binding protein, as well as inhibin. Okay, these cells contain that aromatase enzyme that we saw in females as well, that helped to form estrogen. Okay, so they can produce estrogen. Okay, but sperm development is primarily dependent on the release of androgens from these Sertoli cells. Okay, and then the Leydig cells, they're the primary source of testosterone. Okay, so testosterone is just like a more powerful version of those androgens that are released from the adrenal gland that we talked about last time. Okay, but those Leydig cells can also convert those androgens released from the Sertoli cells and from the adrenal gland to testosterone, just like we saw the conversion of those androgens into estrogen in females. Okay, so this kind of takes you through the process of sperm development. You can see kind of the sperm stem cells here. Those are the ones going through mitosis, meaning that they can constantly go through cellular division to make more, right? Really, they're making more of these primary spermatocytes. And they go to secondary, and then they go to these early spermatids, okay? And the spermatids are embedded in the walls of that seminiferous tubule. All of this is happening in that seminiferous tubule, okay? And then eventually those will convert into these later spermatids that actually start to have the flagella there. And we can see the Leydig cells down here, right? And then yeah, and we can see the Sertoli cells kind of embedded in between those. And there, sorry, this is not the cell itself. This whole thing is the cell. Okay, so this whole thing is the Sertoli cell. Those sperm, early sperms their heads are embedded in the walls of those Sertoli cells. Okay. Go ahead.
So are those developing spermatids up to the spermatic gummy? Are those part of the Sertoli cell as well on this diagram?
No, the Sertoli cells are really just kind of this pink part that kind of goes around it.
Okay.
Yeah, and then these are the developing sperm cells or sperm stem cells.
Okay.
Yeah, good clarification. Okay, so other questions on that? Okay, so then when we look at the contents of semen, typically somewhere around 2 to 5 mils of fluid per ejaculation. Only about 10% of that is sperm, okay? But that's still a lot, 100 million sperm per mil of semen, right? So it could be up to 500 million sperm in one ejaculation. Okay, so the other things it contains acid buffers to neutralize the urethra as well as the vagina. Okay, typically acidic in those areas. Okay, there's also some fructose to give the sperm some fuel for producing ATP. Right, so that fructose can be sent into the sperm, burnt in the mitochondria and create ATP. Okay, prostaglandins are also found here, which that actually stimulates uterine and cervix contraction. And so this can help this can actually start labor. So it's one of the recommended things to do is to have intercourse when a couple is trying to stimulate labor, but it also can help with fertilization because it can help kind of move the sperm upwards a little bit with the contraction. Okay, also clotting factors in semen that kind of just helps it to stick to the walls and not get flushed out. And yeah, and then the ejaculation process, we talked about how erection was a part of the parasympathetic nervous system, and then ejaculation is a part of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so there's kind of this interesting process that happens when sperm get into the less acidic environment of the uterus and the cervix. They activate via these special calcium channels that pretty much activate them to produce more ATP and swim faster. And so it's kind of just this like, yeah, power up, supercharged type thing that happens. And they also are very interestingly contain, yeah, it's a picture like a Super Mario Brothers thing or something, but they also contain olfactory receptors, which actually senses certain pheromones released by the ovaries and kind of draws them towards the ovaries, which is super interesting too. Yeah. So, okay. Questions on any of that? Yeah, so the acrosome is just a part of it's the head of the sperm pretty much. Yeah. And so it has these enzymes that it releases that can kind of help break down parts of the wall of the egg to allow for that penetration. Okay. All right, so a very, very common disorder in males is erectile dysfunction. So men over 40, half of men over 40 experience some level of erectile dysfunction. And typically this is due to damage of the artery walls, which leads to a decrease in nitric oxide, NO formation. Okay, and that's the most common cause. with the rise of the internet and internet pornography, another version of this has been described, which is pornography-induced erectile dysfunction, which is pretty much training of the male's brain in such a way that it can only be stimulated by very extreme images and other things that aren't really like real interaction, not really like real sexual interactions. And so when it comes to a real sexual interaction, erection can't happen. Couple of the common treatments, the drugs that we've all heard of, we've all been seeing commercials of for so long, Cialis, Viagra. Most of those act in this way. So this is a smooth muscle cell that surrounds the arteries in the penis, but all over. And what we see here is there's a phosphodiesterase, which is pretty much responsible for stopping smooth muscle relaxation. So we need to relax smooth muscle in order to get the blood flow to the penis, right? And so this phosphodiesterase inhibits that process from happening. Okay, so what most of those drugs do is they block phosphodiesterase. So they're phosphodiesterase inhibitors, which then allows this cyclic GMP process to continue, which then causes decreased calcium, which doesn't let the smooth muscle relax as much as when it doesn't let it contract. And so when it does contract, it doesn't allow for blood flow. When it relaxes is when blood flow is allowed to come in. So that's the most common type of drug, but then there's some newer types of drugs over here that work in a similar fashion, but they just activate a different pathway to lead to smooth muscle relaxation, which is a cyclic AMP dependent process over there. Okay. Questions about any of that? Okay. All right. So hormones here on the male side of things. So LH, FSH, these obviously get their name from their roles in the female. So definitely no corpus luteum and no follicle in males, but they still got the same name. Okay. So LH stimulates those Leydig cells to release testosterone. So LH, Leydig, that helps you connect it, causes the release of testosterone. Okay. FSH stimulate the other cells, those Sertoli cells, and those are releasing chemicals to aid in the whole production and development of sperm. Okay, those Sertoli cells also release inhibin. So very similar cells to what we saw with the granulosa and the thecal cells in the ovaries, but just slightly different here. Okay, testosterone is going to help with sperm development, and then all of the male secondary sex characteristics that we're familiar with. And then inhibin is very important for controlling the rate of sperm production, as well as giving some negative feedback here. Okay, so the production of testosterone and its action is kind of shown here. Okay, so again, it's an intracellular receptor that activates transcription, just like all of the cholesterol-based or steroid hormones that we talked about have been so far. Okay, so it gets in there, all right, binds to an intracellular receptor, and then has all of its effects via transcription in some way. Okay. A key enzyme that we see in here is called this 5-alpha reductase. Okay. And 5-alpha reductase is required to have kind of more powerful effects of testosterone. Okay. And that's one that is sometimes a target for certain drugs, is that 5-alpha reductase. These are kind of the broad effects of testosterone. One thing that occurs when exogenous testosterone is taken, right? So like injectable steroids that are meant to kind of build muscle mass. One of the things that happens is, since testosterone is providing negative feedback to the hypothalamus and the pituitary for the release of LH and FSH, that decreases the release of LH and FSH, right? So then we don't get the same stimulation of the testes for sperm production, for all the other things that LH and FSH do, right? They don't just cause the release of testosterone, they do lots of stuff for sperm development, and then more production of androgens. And so by taking exogenous testosterone, it actually ends up decreasing the release of LH and FSH. So then we get other effects like infertility for one, right? Because their sperm development isn't happening. And the next slide kind of goes through some of the negative effects of exogenous testosterone use. We'll talk about that next. Say it again, honey. LH and FSH, yeah. Okay, so anabolic steroid side effects, infertility, we just talked through that one, right? So if there's no or low LH and FSH, serotoli cells stop working or can even die. Without stimulation at all, they can actually die off and lead to the loss of the blood testis barrier, which will destroy the eventual would destroy any chance of sperm production in the future as well. Cardiovascular disease leads to high cholesterol levels, unusual thickening of the heart muscle, can damage liver because the liver metabolizes the steroids for us. We're given too much. Okay, central nervous system effects, gynecomastia, which is shown here. Okay, breast development in males. This is because testosterone isn't that far off from estrogen. And so if there's just this excessive amounts of testosterone, the body will sometimes convert that into estrogen and men can start having some secondary female sex characteristics. And then ulcerated acne, because the sebaceous oil glands are stimulated by testosterone. So just terrible, terrible acne like this. Okay. All right, so the next slide has a little kind of a recap of the male sex hormone control loop. So why don't you guys talk through that for a second, kind of fill in what's happening and what's being released in each of those numbers there, and we'll come back together here in a sec. Yeah, and this would also be a good time for a short break as well, so go ahead and feel free to do that. All right. So when we look at these hormones here, which one's coming from the hypothalamus to start this whole thing? GnRH, okay. And then we got 2 coming from, or number 2 there is going to go down and, well, yeah, so GnRH. Let's start with number 2 being FSH. So then which types of cells is FSH going to stimulate? Sertoli, okay, so we got our FSH here, okay. And then 3 is going to be those Sertoli cells, okay, and they're going to release all kinds of certain chemicals to aid in sperm development, right? So those are the ones that the sperm are just embedded in, right? So this whole thing is the Sertoli cell, right? Okay, and then number 4 is going to be our LH. That's going to go to the Leydig cells, as you see there. Okay, those Leydig cells are going to then release what? Testosterone. Okay, we see testosterone. And then we see some negative feedback by 2 different mechanisms, right? Number 6 would be the negative feedback by testosterone. And then number 7 is what? Which one is also providing negative feedback? Inhibin, yeah. All right, so we get inhibin release from the Sertoli cells as well, leading to some negative feedback to the up above. Okay, the 3 kind of primary general effects of testosterone are number 1, those secondary sex characteristics. It also causes growth, right? This is why people take exogenous testosterone to increase muscle mass, okay, as well as helping in sperm development. Okay. So there it is. Questions on any of this? Just because it's really just negative feedback, I guess, would be the one way to write it. Yeah. By testosterone, right? Yeah. Mhm. Okay. Any other questions on those? Go ahead, Audrey.
Just to make sure I got this right. So
Yeah.
testosterone can increase the sperm level if it's in the right spot, so being in the testes, whereas if it's injected into the body, then it creates a negative feedback loop and it actually inhibits sperm development.
It's not necessarily about its location. it's just about the fact that its release here is stimulated by FSH and L or by LH, right? But when we get LH release, we also get FSH release, and FSH is doing all this stuff.
So it's bypassing
Here.
that step, but straight.
Yeah, so it's just going straight to negative feedback. So then we cut off the release of these, so we don't get the sperm development. We don't get the inhibin release. So there's kind of we're just kind of cutting off that hormone loop there. Does that make sense? Yeah. Good. Yeah. Good. Other questions on that? Okay, so we're just going to briefly talk about the pancreas and insulin and glucagon mostly, and as well as diabetes. Okay, so the pancreas is interesting because it's both endocrine and exocrine, right? It has digestive functions, which we'll talk about in the GI tract. Okay, those cells are primarily called those cells are called the Acini cells. These secrete pancreatic juice for digestion. We'll talk about a lot of that coming up soon. Okay, but then the endocrine side of the pancreas, the cells are called the islets of Langerhans. And there's 4 primary cell types. So there's A cells, B cells, D cells, and F cells. Okay, so the A cells are also known as alpha cells. Okay, those are the ones that produce glucagon. Okay, and glucagon, the stimulus for the release of glucagon would be low. I'm just going to do BG for blood glucose. Okay, so when our blood sugar is low, that stimulates these alpha cells or these A cells to release glucagon. Okay, and then their action is to increase blood glucose. Okay, but it does this by glycogen breakdown. In the liver. Okay, so our primary site that we store glycogen outside of skeletal muscle is the liver. And so glucagon tells the liver to break down glycogen and turn it back into glucose and then release that glucose into the blood. Okay, then the beta cells, which are 20% of these islet of Langerhans cells, their stimulus would be high blood sugar. Okay, so high blood glucose. And insulin has lots of actions, but it's going to help to decrease blood glucose. Okay, we got a lot more actions of insulin on the next slide we'll talk about. Okay, and then we also have D cells, which produce a hormone called somatostatin. Somatostatin also can be released by cells lining the intestines. Okay, stimuli for its release are pretty much the presence of nutrients. Okay, so glucose, amino acids, as well as CCK secretion. We'll get to that more in the digestive tract. Don't worry too much about it now. Okay, it has more paracrine actions, which means it doesn't necessarily go into the bloodstream and affect the whole body. It just affects the cells that are kind of close to it. Okay, so it does this. Its actions are to inhibit insulin, glucagon, and pancreatic polypeptide release. Okay, so it kind of has this. Kind of helps control the secretion of glucose and insulin just kind of right there next to it. Okay, and then it also is involved in gastric emptying. We'll talk more about that later. Okay, and then F cells release pancreatic polypeptide, which is stimulated when we eat protein, as well as when we exercise or fast, or we have hypoglycemia. And its role is to slow food absorption with protein consumption. Okay, we'll spend most of the time talking about insulin and glucagon. The other 2 have minor roles. Okay, so all the actions of insulin. Okay, so insulin first is a protein hormone, right? So that means where's it gonna have its effects, on the outside of the cell or the inside of the cell? Outside, right? It can't get through the cell membrane, so it's got to have an insulin receptor, right? So we see this insulin receptor binds to it, sets off this chain of events inside second messenger system style. Okay, it's anabolic, meaning that it causes growth. Okay, it's all kind of known as a hormone of abundance, right? So it leads to storage of all of our macronutrients, storage of carbohydrates. It leads to the formation of glycogen. Okay, that's storage of carbohydrates. It causes protein synthesis. Okay, it causes storage of fat as well. Okay, it also activates the use of a bunch of different glucose transporters, because if we got a bunch of glucose on board, we need to get that in somehow. So insulin's responsible for doing that. They're all called GLUT, and then there's just different ones. So GLUT 1 through 7, pretty much. GLUT 4 is the one that is going to be directly stimulated by insulin in muscle cells, fat cells, and most cells in the body. And so when insulin binds to the outside of a cell, it leads to GLUT4 translocation. So here's a bunch of GLUT4 kind of in a vesicle ready to be released, ready to go to the surface with the stimulation of insulin, right? So insulin binds, activates this vesicle to send these proteins up. And then we open up a bunch of gates for glucose to come into the cell, right? And that's pretty much what GLUT4 is. Okay. It also, we also increase GLUT4 via exercise by activating AMP kinase, as well as the increase of calcium that we see from the sarcoplasmic reticulum inside of our skeletal muscle leads to the release of GLUT4. So this little image down here shows kind of the normal pathway with insulin of getting GLUT4 to the surface, but then exercise and muscle contraction also leads to GLUT4 coming to the surface. And it can happen in a couple ways. Number one is when we use up a bunch of ATP, that makes a ratio of AMP, which is broken down ATP to ATP higher. So that stimulates GLUT4. And then also when we release all that calcium in our sarcoplasmic reticulum, sets off a chain of events that leads to GLUT4 as well. So both those things are related to exercise, directly stimulate GLUT4 translocation. And this is why it's so important for type 2 diabetics to exercise, is because this is a totally insulin independent mechanism, right? Insulin's not needed for GLUT4 to go to the surface of the cell if we're exercising. And since this mechanism is broken in diabetics and type 2 diabetics, it's nice to be able to activate another mechanism to get GLUT4 to come to the surface. And the effects of that can last for 3 days at a time. One bout of exercise can stimulate GLUT4 production for 72 hours in cells. So. Okay, insulin also activates absorption of glucose in both small intestine and reabsorption in the kidneys. Okay, and then it also increases potassium entry into cells. Okay, all kinds of actions of insulin up here, even more than those I just have on the other part of the slide. Okay, so very powerful and potent hormone that has actions all throughout the body. Okay. So when we think about diabetes, diabetes mellitus in particular, we talked about diabetes insipidus last time. Diabetes mellitus, again, is when we have too much sugar in our blood for some reason. Okay, so this can be type 1, which I'm sure most of you know is an autoimmune disorder, and those beta cells are destroyed by the immune system. Okay, so that means no or little insulin production. This is only about 5% of the diabetics in the US. Insulin or type 1 diabetes is on the rise, as are all autoimmune disorders in the US and in Western countries, but it's still a small percentage of the diabetics in the US. Okay, used to be called juvenile diabetes, not so much anymore. Type 2 diabetes used to be called adult onset. That one is showing up in more in kids now, and that's why those two terms don't apply anymore. Okay, the pathology here is that insulin is still available, at least in the early stages of type 2 diabetes, but the mechanism of it binding to the insulin receptor and then all the chain of events that are supposed to occur inside the cell to lead to GLUT4 production, there's multiple broken steps inside the cell. Okay, so that's just known as insulin resistance. We get insulin to bind to the cell, but it doesn't lead to as much glucose absorption in the cells. This is 95% of the diabetics in the US is type 2. Gestational diabetes is similar in pathology to type 2 diabetes, but it only occurs during pregnancy, and most of the time it goes away after delivery. And so this is why women while they're pregnant get their blood sugar checked on checkups. And this is if it goes kind of unchecked, if gestational diabetes is allowed to kind of continue and blood sugar levels are somewhat high, then it can lead to multiple problems in the baby, like higher risk of diabetes later, also very large birth weight, which can lead to complications during pregnancy, and risk of higher chance of obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease in the baby. Okay, so with type 1, again, if we don't have insulin, the body really can't get glucose into the cells by its normal mechanism. And so it turns to other sources, right? It starts breaking down protein. Skeletal muscle is our main place. We have some protein sitting around, right? So skeletal muscle wasting goes to fat storage, our normal fatty acids, but then the liver starts producing ketone bodies, right? Which everybody's familiar with that now because of the keto diet, right? But same idea that if this is a starvation mechanism, right? Your body is starving, and so it starts producing these fats that serve as a good fuel, but they're also very acidic, right? And so then this is one of the common causes of metabolic acidosis is DKA, so diabetic ketoacidosis is what a lot of type 1 diabetics present with in the hospital when they're first diagnosed, or most diabetics end up in DKA multiple times throughout their throughout their life, just because maybe they ran out of insulin or different things can happen and they end up back in the hospital in DKA. So one of the life-threatening parts of type 1 diabetes is the dehydration that occurs. Again, glucose reabsorption is supposed to happen in the kidneys, right? So glucose is filtered into the filtrate with the rest of the fluid, but then those kidney cells' job is to pull all that glucose back, not let it go out in the urine, but they have a max capacity to do that. And if there's so much glucose in the blood, they can't pull all that glucose back. That creates osmotic pressure in the filtrate, right? So then that holds on to water with it, right? And just produces massive amounts of urine to the point where it can lead to death via dehydration in type 1 diabetics. So excessive urine is just known as polyuria, which also leads to excessive thirst, which is polydipsia. Okay, so diabetic coma is kind of this term that's just thrown out there. It can mean a lot of different things, but it's loss of consciousness for some reason. It could be due to hyperventilation because of that acidosis. Could be due to very low blood sugar, which is life-threatening. Could be due to severe hydration, or it could be due to hyperosmolar coma, which is because of that very high osmolarity of the blood can throw off your nervous system function. So some diabetic comas are due to low blood sugar, some are due to high blood sugar. They don't necessarily all always mean the same thing, right? Okay. Just real quick on some of the treatments for type 1 diabetes. This is known as the artificial pancreas, which is pretty much becoming quickly the standard of care for type 1 diabetes, which pairs a continuous glucose monitor with an insulin pump, and they communicate with each other. So the insulin pump constantly knows what your blood sugar is from the continuous glucose monitor, and it's taking that information. And if blood sugar is high, it releases more insulin. If blood sugar is dropping, it stops the release of insulin. Right? And this is pretty much what your pancreas does, but obviously not quite as effective as your pancreas. But this is incredible advances in the care of type 1 diabetes for sure. So no more finger pricks really for type 1 diabetics. No more injections of insulin. Most of it's done through the pump, and it's pretty fantastic. Yeah. So for the most part, type 1 diabetics don't have to limit carbohydrate intake. This is one of my son's pet peeves. When somebody finds out that he's a type 1 diabetic, go, oh, he can't have a cookie then, or he can't have this. And he's like, no, I can have that. It's really just like liquid sugar that type 1 diabetics can't have much of, because the insulin just doesn't act fast enough to deal with that. But they can have as many carbs as they want, as long as they're accounting for it with their insulin. So yeah.
So
Go ahead, John. Yeah,
so the exercise, does that only affect the cells which are exercising, or is there like a body-wide effect on the insulin?
Well, so the deal is 85% of our glucose disposal happens at skeletal muscle. So it's primarily affecting skeletal muscle, but that's where almost all of our glucose is disposed anyway. So yeah. Audrey, what are you gonna say?
Is it talked about the insulin?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Yeah, so Humalog is the most common one. That's what Soren has, and it's just an interesting process that they actually use bacteria to make that protein. They kind of program that bacteria to pump out the protein. That's just what the pharmaceutical industry does. Similar to actually how some of those messenger RNA vaccines were produced, like the COVID vaccine. They use bacteria in that process as well to form that. It's pretty fascinating. So yeah. Okay. Lastly here with type 2 diabetes. So definitely a huge genetic component here for sure. Race and ethnicity is definitely involved as well. Physical inactivity and obesity are directly linked to this. This is definitely more considered a lifestyle disease than it is than type 1 diabetes, where it's we don't, yeah, it's not really that controllable with lifestyle as far as the onset of it. Okay, but the disease progression with type 2 diabetes is it starts with the cells stop responding to insulin as well as they used to, right? So then it takes more and more insulin to get the same amount of glucose brought into your cells. Okay, and then so then your pancreas is having to work harder and harder and harder for many years, and throughout that process, your pancreatic function starts declining as well. And so by the time that the blood glucose levels are actually high, that's probably been years and years and years of insulin resistance by the time you actually see higher blood glucose levels. And by the time, by the time diagnosis of type 2 diabetes happens, there's usually only about 40% of beta cell function left. And so the way that we diagnose type 2 diabetes is not ideal. We diagnose it by glucose levels, but for probably 4 to 10 years before that, they've had high insulin levels that have been compensating for that. Okay, and so by the time we actually find out that, oh, they have high glucose now, their pancreas has been fighting so hard that 60% of it is lost already. And so now it's not just the fact that we have insulin resistance, but we also have decreased insulin release now as well by the time type 2 diabetes is involved or is diagnosed. So it's not just insulin resistance in type 2 diabetics. And then the far advanced type 2 diabetics, they don't have any insulin release at all. So you might have heard of type 2 diabetics that also have to do insulin injections, and that is common in the later stages of type 2 diabetes as well. Okay. So how do we diagnose it? It's all about glucose levels, right? So it could either be hemoglobin A1C or fasting glucose levels. Okay, but like I said, insulin resistance was present for a long time before that ever happened. Hemoglobin A1C is just a look at how much hemoglobin is stuck, or sorry, how much glucose is stuck to the hemoglobin in our red blood cells. And that gives us pretty much an average glucose for about a month. Okay, 4 to 6 weeks average glucose. So it's a nice way to look at something that's not just what it is right there in that fasting moment. Gives you like an average. Okay, so lots and lots of consequences of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, 2 to 4 times more likely to have a heart attack or a stroke in a type 2 diabetic, kidney failure because the kidneys are dealing with all that excessive glucose in the urine. Blindness is very common in type 2 diabetics. The one I don't have on here, which I should, is Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is actually known in the literature as kind of in a snarky way, type 3 diabetes, because it's so common. Most type 2 diabetics will have some level of mental decline because of the effects of high glucose on neurons, damages neurons so significantly. And so the treatments definitely are mostly lifestyle, as well as insulin sensitizing drugs, and then later stages, insulin injections. Questions on any of that? Okay, and then lastly, just to kind of hit home the point that it's not just insulin resistance in type 2 diabetes. That is what we see here. That's one of the 3 primary factors, is we have a decrease in that insulin signaling pathway, which is related to mitochondrial dysfunction in our skeletal muscle. Okay, but it's also related to lipid accumulation in our skeletal muscle. But that's one of the 3 primary factors. The other one is loss of beta cells. So we get type 2 diabetics have less insulin secretion, even upon diagnosis, not just in later stages. But then the other big one, HGP, stands for hepatic glucose production. And so that's the liver. When the liver gets built up fat in it from high levels of visceral fat. So visceral fat's the fat around our organs, which leads to a buildup of fat in the liver. And then that liver also becomes insulin insensitive. And the liver's main job when we're fasting in regards to glucose is to control glucose levels, right? So when we're not eating, something's got to keep our glucose levels up. And so our liver is responsible for doing that. But when we do eat, insulin's released. Insulin's supposed to go to the liver, tell the liver, all right, stop releasing glucose because we have plenty because we just ate. But that mechanism is broken in type 2 diabetics. And so the liver is just constantly pumping out a bunch of glucose into the blood in type 2 diabetics. And so that's kind of the third factor that leads to high blood sugar in type 2 diabetics. All right. 12:30 on the dot. We made it. Okay. All right. Well, study hard, everybody. Email me questions if you have them. If it's too complicated, we can hop on a Zoom real quick and work it out. But good luck on the exam. Study hard, and we'll see you guys next week. Okay.